When Milwaukee police discovered murdered and mutilated bodies in the home of American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, monster became an understatement. They examined his crimes, and this week I visited the neighborhood where he murdered at least 16 people. Let's explore the Jeffrey Dahmer case here on Profiling Evil. Well, welcome to Profiling Evil. To those of you who are already channel members, thanks for joining us. And for all of you that are just coming on board, thanks a lot for joining up. To all of you, thanks for the support. If you're new to Profiling Evil, I hope that you'll hit the like and subscribe button right now. Make sure you're ringing that bell so that you get notifications when we release videos. You know, this week I was at meetings for the International Chiefs Association in Milwaukee. In the evenings, I'd walk around Jeffrey Dahmer's haunted hunting grounds, his Milwaukee home. I chatted with neighbors in the complex next to the apartment building where he was, and I explored the community that was paralyzed with confusion when police announced this killer had been dissecting and consuming people that he'd murdered. We're going to go back a ways. It all happened in 1991, and the case sped through the criminal justice system after Dahmer's arrest. This guy never denied killing his victims, and the necrophilia-driven cannibal even shared how he planned on building an altar, something he planned on building made up of bones of his victims. It was going to be a special place where he could sit in his little throne and reflect on his memories of killing those innocent human beings. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You know, there are mixed messages when we consider Dahmer's childhood. There are some things that suggest he was a deprived person, that as an infant, he had a tough time, and as a child, he had a tough time. Yet other people say that he was doted upon and taken way too much care of, a mama's boy. Well, what it appears is that he was energetic and a happy kid with a really small number of friends, though. And as his circle of influence started to increase, this kid started to decrease in his socialization. It's reported that the young Dahmer had an interest early on, perhaps even a fascination with dead animals. It happened and started, he says, as he watched his father removing a skeletonized animal from under the family's home. This led to a curious examination of the bodies of any animals that he would find, some that he killed. Dahmer started collecting small animals, and he kept their bodies in bottles with formaldehyde. And before long, this kid was actually bleaching the bones of those little animals to better preserve them. Now, how significant is that? On one occasion in 1975, Dahmer decapitated the carcass of a dog that he found before nailing the body of the dog to a tree and impaling the skull upon a stick in the woods. Now, I don't know whether he killed that dog or he actually stumbled upon it, but we see this early fascination with animals, and you know it kind of fits in that homicidal triangle that's often talked about. But by high school, this kid was considered an outcast, and apparently, and according to public reports, he started drinking hard liquor regularly. He was really uncommunicative, although Dahmer was considered by many to be polite, and some even suggested that he was highly intelligent. But it was at this time in his life that he discovered that he was gay. Before long, Dahmer started fantasizing about dominating and controlling male partners. Now, I hope you'll go back and watch my video on fantasy versus reality, where we talk about those principles. You'll find it in the Profiling Evil Academy. Dahmer's fantasies gradually became intertwined with thoughts of mutilation, and by age 16, Dahmer was attempting to act out his first assault. Dahmer's parents had reportedly long had a troubled marriage and were going through the initial stages of a divorce that finished by the time he was finishing high school. And the graduating senior found himself acting out regularly, drinking, and spiraling out of control. It would be about a year or two later, somewhere around age 20, that he committed his first murder, killing 19-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Mark Hicks. Now, Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell, and then he strangled him. He needed that personal contact. He buried Hicks in his basement, later rethought that, and dug him up and reburied him in a shallow grave in the backyard. He then started thinking more about that. So we see this level of disorganization and him trying to figure out how to be successful. Well, several weeks later, he exhumes Hicks and he spreads his remains in the woods behind his family home. He then tries to go to college, does about 3 months in college, and finds that that's just not working for him. He's just not doing well. So he enlists in the United States Army, where he gets trained as a medical specialist. Now, knowing that this guy had experimented with animals as a child and teen kind of makes it interesting to me. And it doesn't seem odd that with his fascination with anatomy, that he would roll this over into his military experience. You see, working as a medical specialist in the military gave him a legitimate way to pursue his interests, perhaps even perfect his methodologies. Well, Dahmer's alcohol abuse worsened in the Army, and he was discharged 2 years later. Public records suggest that it was an honorable discharge, but it notes that Dahmer was not suited for the military. I'd really like to know more about that if anyone has any information, but it's about this time, upon his release, that he requests to be transferred or moved on his release to Florida. There, he couldn't make it on his own, so he returns home to his father's house, now living in Ohio. He continues to drink excessively at his father's house, and that's becoming problematic. So then he relocates to Wisconsin and he moves into his grandmother's home. I guess the family may have hoped that she could somehow straighten him out. And he actually finds some success there for the next couple of years, holds a regular job, but then he gets arrested for indecent exposure. Shortly after, he starts hanging out at Milwaukee's gay bars, the bathhouses, and the bookstores. It's during this time that he said he trained himself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of people. Now, this is really interesting because later in this interview and in this discussion that we're having today, I talk about a question of whether his murders were racially motivated. Most of his victims were black. I think you'll see as we go on, Dahmer was really impressed with what he considered to be really good looking men. And here's what's really important to me, though, is that he really didn't look at them as human beings. They were objects, they were props, stage props, for lack of a better term, in this little act that he was putting together in his mind. Well, then Dahmer starts killing again. He begins with a 25-year-old named Stephen Tuomi. By morning time, after getting Tuomi's dead, brutally beaten. Now, Dahmer stuffs him in a large suitcase that he stores at his grandmother's house for a week. Can you imagine how this was starting to smell? After a week, he mutilates the body into small pieces so that he can dispose of it. Then, 2 months later, he kills a 14-year-old Native American prostitute named James Doxtator. Then he kills a 22-year-old kid named Richard Guerrero, a 13-year-old boy. And think about this. He's getting these young kids or frail kids or small frame kids for a couple of reasons. One, I believe, is that he can control them more easily. But he doesn't control them face to face. He inebriates them, or he laces their drinks with drugs, or he bludgeons them to where he can get control. He doesn't have the confidence to do this physically. He has to do it through other guises. Well, his victim list is starting to grow on and on. A 24-year-old named Anthony, and the numbers just go on and on. And you can explore each of Dahmer's victims online, or make sure you pick up a book called The Man Who Could Not Kill Enough: The Secret of Milwaukee's Jeffrey Dahmer by Ann Schwartz. And I'm going to be interviewing Ann later, so watch for that interview as you get through this series of 3 videos on Dahmer. But by 1991, Dahmer's neighbors at the Oxford Apartments are starting to complain to the apartment's manager of foul smell coming from apartment 213. And who lives in 213? Jeffrey Dahmer. They also complain of the sound of power tools in the night, yelling in the night, thumps, screaming, but nothing happens. Now, at this time, there's this amazingly disgusting case with a young man, 14-year-old Conrad Sinsifome, and I hope I got his name right. This Laotian kid escaped Dahmer's apartment. He escaped drugged and naked, but Dahmer pursues him into the street as police officers are approaching. And he convinces the police officers that they're a couple. In fact, he's allowed to take the boy home, and he says he later drills a hole in the boy's skull and injects hydrochloric acid in it, eventually killing him. Here's the crux of that case, because it's really disappointing, really tragic, and a real failure of the system. 3 women discovered this 14-year-old boy after he'd managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment, naked, bruised, bleeding, and heavily sedated. Their 911 call brought police and ambulance personnel who tried to communicate with this boy, but he was so sedated and so injured that he couldn't communicate. Dahmer walks up, approaches police, and convinces them that the boy is his 19-year-old lover. Now, this is all happening against the protests of the 3 women who were screaming at police that this cannot be true. Police discount the women and release the boy back into Dahmer's custody. Dahmer would later say that the boy was dead within 60 minutes of police leaving the area. And I believe 5 other people died at his hands before he was finally captured. Well, both police officers were fired for their actions, but a judge later ruled in their favor, returning them to police work. Listen as one of those officers discusses that night in this video.
I exited the car. I was the passenger of the car. There was a group of people in the alley, and they were all pointing to a white male and a second Asian male who was naked just east of our location in the alley. My partner came up to me and told me that he had obtained information from the white male to whom he was talking to, and basically that the Asian male's name was John Hamong, and that he was 20 years old, and that he had been staying with him for the last, I believe he said, 2 to 3 weeks.
Had been staying with whom?
With Mr. Dahmer. He also had obtained Dahmer's name at that point. Officer Perupkin and myself and the Asian male and Jeffrey Dahmer began walking toward the rear of the apartment. While we walked back to the apartment, Mr. Dahmer spoke of the crime in the neighborhood and how bad he thought it was. He said he was glad that the police were in the neighborhood and that there was a need for the police. I believe he may have been smoking a cigarette during that time. As we got near to the apartment building, it was the rear of the apartment building, obviously, he spoke of the need for extra locks on his apartment and that he had a security system because of the crime and the nature of the neighborhood.
He showed you up to his apartment?
That's correct.
And he convinced you that you could go about your business, that he had everything under control?
We were convinced that all was well.
And there wasn't anything that you saw that could for one moment have caused you to believe that there was any problem at all, correct?
There was nothing.
Dahmer told me that after the police left, he gave a second injection of muriatic acid, and that proved fatal. But even then, he was attempting to carry out the plan to create a zombie. His words were, "Then I gave him the second injection of muriatic acid, and that was fatal. I didn't intend it to be, but it was."
Don't forget.
Well, on July 22nd, 1991, Dahmer convinces another person, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, to come to his apartment. Dahmer's attempt to subdue Edwards fails, and the unclothed victim runs into the street, flagging down 2 Milwaukee police officers. Upon investigating the apartment where Edwards said he was abducted, held against his will, and assaulted, the police discover Polaroid pictures of human bodies in various stages of dismemberment. Then, when they open the refrigerator, they discover a freshly severed head. As they arrest Dahmer, he calmly utters, quote, "For what I did, I should be dead," close quote. Well, over the next 2 weeks, Dahmer confesses to murder after murder. In all, they conducted more than 60 hours of interrogation, collecting a confession where he readily admitted to having murdered 17 young men, dating back as far as 1978. As I walked up this hill where Jeffrey Dahmer lived, I found really a pretty peaceful neighborhood. It's so hard to imagine that these kinds of things are happening in plain sight. I walked up, I found that the only remnant of Dahmer's apartment complex was a big green hillside and a companion structure to the side. I walked around and spoke with residents of the complex. And do you know that most of them, and maybe we should be glad about this, most didn't even know that this was the place where Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 16 people. One resident actually exclaimed, "Holy smokes, that explains why so many people come and take pictures of this place." Which brings me to another interesting point. Why are we so fascinated with these serial killers? There are people that are actually dressing and shaving and cutting their hair so that they look like Jeffrey Dahmer. They've been inside Shaker's cigar bar. It creeps Bob Weiss out. That's the person I want to talk about next, because one of the most knowledgeable people about Dahmer is the owner of Shaker's, Bob Weiss. Bob and I talked a lot about Dahmer and the memories that Bob had in the years before these gruesome murders were discovered. You see, Dahmer would come into his bar on a regular basis, ordering his favorite drink, gin and tonic. He'd sip it through his straw, and it creeped Bob Weiss out. He said that every time he served him a beverage in town, he got a creepy feeling. Now, Bob prides himself on having a staff made up of mostly women. He found it odd that Dahmer was never impressed with the women there, never seemed interested. He thinks that these women are a better judge of the clientele, and he actually teaches them to watch out for unsuspecting things like creeps like Dahmer, who drop drugs into the drinks of unaware clients. Now, make sure you catch my full interview with Bob Weiss in the next episode. But let's get back to Dahmer for a minute. Most of Dahmer's victims were rendered unconscious prior to their murders, although some died as a result of having acid or boiling water injected into their brains. This is so significant in my opinion because Dahmer just didn't have the confidence or the strength physically to control his victims without first incapacitating them with alcohol, drugs, or in many cases, a blow to the head. But that didn't stop him from keeping his victims semi-conscious as long as he possibly could, so that he could act out his bizarre and disgusting fantasies before killing them through some form of experimentation. Now, records suggest that almost all of the murders Dahmer committed after moving into the Oxford apartments involved this ritualistic posing of the victims' bodies, usually in some kind of a suggestive position and in keeping with his fantasies. This predator engaged in incredibly disgusting acts with his victims during and after their deaths and during their dismemberment. I spoke to a person in Dahmer's neighborhood that was a child when all of this was happening. He said he used to play in the apartment building, but he recalls the smell of rotting flesh. He said it was so strong that he always went outside to play instead. Now, whenever Dahmer's apartment manager was confronted with complaints about the smells that were coming from his apartment, media reports suggest that the Dahmer simply explained it away as sewage problems or something like a freezer that quit working and the spoiled contents were causing the smell. Well, in reality, spoiled contents were causing the smell. And as Dahmer neared the time of his arrest, it became apparent that whatever level of organization he may have had was rapidly slipping away. This guy was now killing several times a month, and he was quoted after his arrest saying that he had been completely swept along with his compulsion to kill. He said it was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled his thoughts all day long. Well, after his arrest, police recovered 7 preserved skulls and the entire skeleton of 2 additional victims in his apartment. When asked about the remains, Dahmer bluntly remarked that he'd been in the process of constructing his own private altar made up of victims' bones. His plan was to use it to display the photographs that he'd been taking of his victims. It included plans of placing a large blue lamp in there with an extended blue globe light of sorts behind the display. And there he'd sit in his black leather chair looking at his altar and reminiscing. When asked who he would dedicate the altar to, he simply replied, "Myself. It's a place where I could feel at home, a place for meditation, and a place that Dahmer believed could be a sense of power for him." Well, within 6 weeks of his arrest, Dahmer was charged with numerous murders in Wisconsin and also an additional murder from Ohio, the location of his first known victim. Now, I personally don't believe these are all of Dahmer's victims, but I guess we'll never know for sure. I cannot believe for a moment there weren't victims in Germany when he was in the army or other places. But there's one thing we know for sure. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't fight the charges against him, and about 8 months later, the guy was convicted. Now, in closing arguments, Dahmer's defense team claimed that his murder spree was the result of a sickness that he discovered, not that something that he chose. Well, I'm going to argue that just a little bit, because while he may not have chose the feelings he had about homosexuality or other things, he certainly chose to fantasize about these things and then act them out. He chose to try to avoid detection. He knew what society standards were, and he chose to violate those. His attorney, he portrayed Dahmer as a desperately lonely and profoundly sick individual, a person who was so out of control that he couldn't conform his conduct anymore. Well, thankfully, there was a prosecutor who was firm in describing Dahmer as calculating, a person who killed to control his victims, and a person who retained their bodies merely to afford himself this prolonged period of pleasure. Shortly after, the court ruled that Dahmer was sane and that he wasn't suffering from a mental disorder, and he was convicted of all 15 murders for which he was tried. But Dahmer had one more thing up his sleeve, and that was to address the court before he was sentenced. Now, in my opinion, this was the last defiant stand for Dahmer, a time when he could take control and reassure that he was in control of everything that was going to happen to him. In his statement, Dahmer emphasized that he had never desired freedom following his arrest, and that he wished for his own death. He stated that none of his murders had been motivated by hatred. that he understood that nothing he could say or do would ever undo the terrible harm that he'd caused the families of his victims and the city of Milwaukee. And he continued by saying that he and his doctors believed that his criminal behavior had been motivated by mental disorders. I'm not responsible. I'm mentally ill, or the devil made me do it. It's not that easy. He chose to make these things happen. Dahmer added that his medical knowledge had given him some peace, and that although he understood that society could never forgive him, he hoped that God would. Dahmer closed his statement with the following. He said, quote, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I've done." He closed by saying, "Thank you, Honor. I'm prepared for your sentence, which I know should be the maximum. I ask for no consideration." And with that, the judge sentenced Jeffrey Dahmer to life in prison plus 10 years on the first 2 counts, with the remaining 13 counts carrying mandatory sentences of life in prison plus 70 years. Now, folks, the death penalty wasn't an option for the judge since Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment clear back in 1853. Dahmer spent the first year in prison in solitary confinement, but he convinced leadership that he would be better off in general population. Well, he got his wish, and he went to general population, where he got on a work detail and started doing some things. It was a move that troubled a lot of people, but not as much as this move. Dahmer started reading the Bible in prison, and he eventually was baptized in a prison whirlpool. A year after that, while cleaning a prison bathroom as part of a work detail, another inmate attempted to kill Dahmer. Dahmer survived, only to have another inmate later bludgeon him to death. Apparently, according to media reports, the inmate who killed Dahmer cornered him in a bathroom while showing him an article from a newspaper about the murders. The inmate demanded Dahmer to answer him whether he was in fact a serial killer. I don't know what the answer was to this, but seconds later, Jeffrey Dahmer was dead. Let's watch this video report of Dahmer's death.
There are shocking new details about the murder of America's most hated serial killer and how he may have seen his own death coming. Tonight, Diane Diamond reports on the plot to kill a killer.
I am happy and very excited that the monster is finally dead.
It was a brutal murder behind bars, a shocking lapse of prison security. And while correction officials promise an investigation, no one involved with the Jeffrey Dahmer case says that they're surprised.
I use the word hit, and that has been one of the rumors that has been running rampant, was that this was some sort of a hit.
Exactly what happened is still not clear. Dahmer was cleaning a prison bathroom with 2 other inmates when suddenly one of them apparently took a broom handle and started beating Dahmer to death. Prison officials say Dahmer's head may have been bashed against a wall.
There was so much animosity toward him, with a number of the inmates were either jealous or resentful over his celebrity status that he had in prison.
Officials say it was this man, Christopher Scarver, who carried out Dahmer's death sentence.
How they caught the assailant is that he was covered with blood. There was apparently a great deal of blood at the scene.
Prison officials won't say why 3 guards assigned to the area left the inmates alone. But for now, they insist the guards did nothing wrong.
I'm confident that staff did everything that they were supposed to be doing in looking out for the safety of the inmates in this situation.
In 1991, Dahmer was sentenced to live out his life here at the state prison in Portage, Wisconsin. But those who knew him say that Dahmer never believed that he'd survive behind bars for very long.
I am not surprised. I had predicted that he would be killed in prison because he had a death wish. He always had a death wish. He was a sick kid. He knew he was sick.
In recent months, Jeffrey Dahmer apparently had found religion. He was formally baptized in May, and in the prison chapel, he confided to the minister about how he was ready to accept the ultimate punishment.
Now that he's a Christian and he felt personally that he deserved to be put to death for his crimes, the question was, am I sinning against God by continuing to live?
So it appears that Jeffrey Dahmer may have wanted to die, to end his tortured life, to rid himself of his inner demons. And to the families of his victims, Jeffrey Dahmer's death sentence finally brings an end to their private suffering.
Whoever did kill him, he's my hero. I will be sending a thank you card to this hero.
The autopsy on Jeffrey Dahmer says he died from multiple skull fractures. Tomorrow, Dahmer's mother speaks out for the first time to Hard Copy, her first public comment since the murder.
This is the man suspected of murdering Jeffrey Dahmer, 25-year-old Christopher Scarver of Milwaukee, serving life for a 1990 murder. The police report from that crime depicts an unstable man. He asked to add a T to his name whenever it appeared as Chris, so it would read Christ. His attorney tried an insanity defense. It failed.
So you have a class of people like Christopher Scarver in penal situations who have mental problems but are incarcerated rather than in hospitals.
Dahmer, according to medical officials, was beaten beyond recognition while working on a 3-convict janitor crew, which included the suspect. A third inmate, Jesse Anderson, was critically injured. The 3 were reportedly left alone for 20 minutes.
It is something that we did not expect, and had we been aware of something pending, we certainly would have taken preventative action.
Although Dahmer's crimes were known worldwide, the murder case against Jesse Anderson made major headlines here in Milwaukee. His attorney believes the prison was negligent for putting 2 notorious inmates together, along with another violent criminal. Attorney Ronald Hendry is also convinced of the motive.
Anybody who sits back and says that they don't think that race had something to do with this probably isn't on the same planet.
Most of Dahmer's victims were minorities. Jesse Anderson, convicted of killing his wife, blamed that murder on 2 black men. Corrections officials have created a special panel to investigate the attack. And a final irony, the divorced parents of Jeffrey Dahmer, the man who dismembered his victims, are fighting over his remains. Dawn Fratangelo, NBC News, Milwaukee.
I remember when this happened. I was sitting in a training class when the announcement came out that Dahmer had been murdered in prison. The family had requested that his body be cremated and his remains be shared between his 2 estranged parents. But I'll never forget this story. And frankly, even though I heard it in the midst of a homicide training class, I still don't know if it's true. So if you do, please let me know. The rumor was that Dahmer's body was taken to the medical examiner's office after his death, that they kept him shackled down. It creeped the medical examiner out so much, according to this report, that he left Jeffrey Dahmer tied to the gurney while he did the examination. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sure makes for great visualization, doesn't it? Now, in my opinion, it just can't be true, but I heard it firsthand, so I needed to share it with you. Now, I also remember hearing, though, that Dahmer's brain was kept by the medical examiner in order to further study it. Again, I don't know if that's true, but I suspect, more like most autopsies, it was more about a sample collection of tissue from the brain was collected and preserved, and it probably still is in the archives of the Wisconsin Medical Examiner's Office. Well, on the 30th anniversary of Dahmer's arrest, the story still captures attention. Watch this WMJ4 news report. I think you'll be interested in just kind of catching up on the entire case.
All right, new at 10, marking 30 years since the arrest of one of the country's most prolific serial killers.
Jeffrey Dahmer was captured in a West Side apartment building where investigators also found barrels of evidence. Rebecca Clough explains how this case changed the city.
From WTMJ-TV, Milwaukee's 24-hour news channel.
Very gruesome discovery in Milwaukee overnight.
Milwaukee police find a horrifying scene inside an apartment building.
Police got here in the middle of the night, and what they found was an apartment full of pieces of people.
30 years ago, Milwaukee woke up to news Jeffrey Dahmer was responsible for killing more than a dozen people. The majority of those murders happened in an apartment near the Marquette campus.
So we thought it was a deep freezer, and now we found out he's got dead bodies in it.
All that remains today of that site is a grassy lot.
The fence was not here. This is all new.
We return there with Claiborne Benson, a former TMJ4 photographer and current executive director of the Wisconsin Black Historical Society Museum. He remembers being there that morning with investigators.
But we could actually see the body parts being carried out the back door.
He'll never forget the people who showed up to the crime scene.
I began to see family members come and ask questions about who were these people and did they know of their loved ones, and they would hold pictures up. They're saying, I'm missing a brother, I'm missing a cousin.
April 7th is when he didn't return back from getting his key made.
The Dahmer case was an awakening for Milwaukee in many ways. An awakening that there were people who were missing, who were not followed up on.
Jeff Fleming works for the city of Milwaukee in the mayor's office. In 1991, he was a reporter for TMJ4.
Clearly, the case of Conarac Synthesimpone raised very serious questions about how the police treated people.
3 months before Dahmer was caught, one of his victims, Conarac Synthesimpone, escaped Dahmer's apartment. An alert neighbor called police when they saw the naked and disoriented 14-year-old boy running down the street. Police showed up, and so did Dahmer. He convinced police the boy was drunk and they were lovers. Police brought the boy back to Dahmer's apartment.
Would they have treated Conarac Synthesimpone differently had he been a blonde woman? Probably they would have.
Fleming says there was an immediate change at the police department.
Certainly it has changed the way the police department views missing persons cases, looking at situations not as quickly dismissive cases, but cases that deserve follow-up.
Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to multiple life sentences for the murder of 17 people. He was killed in prison in 1994. Reporting in Milwaukee, Rebecca Clough, TMJ4 News.
Well, you might consider watching some of the other videos that are online where Dahmer shares his innermost thoughts. Frankly, some of them will leave you scratching your head, like this one with Inside Edition did for me. But it also reminded me of how these cases impact these psychopathic minds. Frankly, they don't. Listen closely as Inside Edition reporters ask Dahmer if his murders were racially motivated and how he feels about them at the time of the interview.
10 of your 17 victims were black. Were they racially motivated?
It was not racially motivated. It was not sexual preference. It was just to find an obsession with the best-looking young man I could find.
While you just heard him say that his sexual preference had nothing to do with the killings, he has not come to terms with his homosexuality.
Never understood it. There was no use trying to fight it because I couldn't rid myself of it. It was too powerful and persistent.
Do you dislike it?
Yes, it's caused a lot of problems for me. A lot of conflicts and unanswered questions.
You'll notice Dahmer doesn't mention anything about his victims. He shows no remorse other than how they inspired him to commit murder. Nope. Instead, he simply says, yes, it's impacted me. It's caused a lot of problems for me, a lot of conflicts and unanswered questions. Well, this is an understatement. I'm interested in what your impressions are, though. Why do you think Dahmer became a serial killer? Would you please put your answers down below and take time to react to each other as they reflect your peers on their opinions? And then answer this question. Why are so many people fascinated by serial killers? And finally, and maybe most importantly, what kind of person is inspired by serial killers? What kind of person tries to mirror the way they look or the way they act or causes them to wear t-shirts that promote them? Well, I hope you found this valuable. We're studying the case of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. If you did find it valuable, please hit the like and subscribe button and ring the bell so that you get all of our notifications. And folks, please consider joining our channel memberships. Share us with your contacts and friends. And make sure you watch for my interview with Bob Weiss of Shaker's Cigar Bar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There, you're going to hear from someone who knew Dahmer, back when he committed these horrible acts. Then, if you've subscribed to our channel, you're going to be notified when my interview with Ann Schwartz comes up. She's the author of that book on Jeffrey Dahmer. It's an awesome book, and you'll want to read it. Hey, thanks for your support of Profiling Evil, and we'll see you all soon at the next crime scene.